Good evening, everyone. The time is now 5 p.m. and the Belton Independent School District Board of Trustees are now convened in a workshop on Monday, March 24, 2025. A quorum of board members is present. This meeting has been duly called. The notice of the meeting has been posted in accordance with the Texas Open Meetings Act, Texas Government Code, Chapter 551. Any further comments? None. Moving on to item 3, board workshop. A, legislative update. B, 2025-2026 budget planning update. And C, 2025-2026 budget assumptions. Dr. Golden?
Yes, thank you, board, and thank you to our cabinet members for joining us at the table. This will be a joint presentation and discussion that several members of cabinet will be assisting us with. And we are here to talk about our 2025-2026 budget planning. So big picture in our time together in this workshop, we're going to provide a very high-level legislative update on bills specifically tied to school funding. Christine's going to help us with that. We're going to talk about budget projections. Melissa's going to run through a couple of runs based on some information that we have right now. It's all preliminary, but wants to give you a big picture. We'll give you an update on, as we've been moving forward with phase 1 of our budget reductions that we shared with you in January's workshop. As we promised in that workshop, we have a couple of cabinet members that will update you on if we were to move forward on phase 2 reductions. There was some model development that needed to happen behind the scenes, and the teams have been working on that. So we want to give you an update on some of those service models. And then we're going to head into budget assumptions and be able to talk about that. Budget assumptions is an action item in tonight's board meeting, so we want to be able to dig into that if you've got any questions, comments, or things that you'd like to see different. And with that, I think we're going to begin with our legislative update from Christine.
So good evening, everyone. This update is very specific to legislation that has to financial impact, and these are very specific to the bills that are currently gaining the most traction. It is by no means all the bills that are being heard right now, but most of the bills that are being heard replicate many factors of some of this in some way, shape, or form. But here on this slide, you'll see the categories on the left-hand side: basic allotment, teacher compensation, safety allotment, special education, weighted allotment, and tax compression and hold harmless. And then the next column is the bills, probably the most important and impactful bills that are being heard on that topic right now in the House, and the ones that originated from the Senate. And just as a reminder, the Senate at this point, their bill that has to do with increased funding for public education doesn't have an adjustment to the basic allotment. However, House Bill 2, which Chair Buckley did tell us when we were in Austin that they are very hopeful that the House bill is where all of those bills are going to collapse into, and so that public ed most likely will carry an HB and it'll be House Bill 2. But right now the Senate doesn't have they have a standalone bill, but it's not gaining any traction for an increase to the basic allotment. So in House Bill 2, it does contain a 222 increase in the basic allotment. There is no current Senate bill that's gained momentum that is doing that. For teacher compensation in House Bill 2, 40% of the basic allotment increase. In the Senate bill version provides longevity allotment, so $2,500 for teachers that have been with a district for 3 to 5 years, and then $5,500 for those that have been with a district over 5 years. Safety allotment. Right now, the House doesn't have anything that's gaining a lot of traction for. They have some that are filed, but they're not moving. It's the Senate version that's really moving, and most likely that will be the one that passes through. And it calls for an increase of to $20 per student, which is a $10 increase, and $30,000 per campus, which is a $15,000 increase. Special education, they are speaking the same language on special education right now. The House and the Senate, and both versions are talking about an intensity of services model. If you'll notice again, everything that I've cited so far in the House is all in House Bill 2. So that's that kitchen sink bill that has everything in it. But all of the bills from the Senate are standalones right now. But they are speaking the same language when it comes to intensity of services model. However, we still do not know exactly what that funding model looks like. But they are talking in terms of that for additional funding for special education. That grew out of the special report and study that they did a couple of years ago that came out of the legislature and asked to really study special education. That's the one that came out this summer that talked about special education being underfunded in Texas by close to $2 billion. So that's where that intensity of services funding model was proposed, and what it's in response to. And then for our weighted allotments for different groups, House Bill 2 does create some different tiers for economically disadvantaged students, and it also has a fine arts allotment. Senate Bill 549 has a fine arts weighted allotment also, but again, that's a standalone, so that's why we are thinking that many of these will get folded into the House Bill 2 for education, and again, most likely why it will be the main driver for the final version of whatever is passed. And then you can see the tax compression and hold harmless. House Bill 2 does have some function and some mechanisms for that built in, and it's Senate Bill 4 that is the standalone from the Senate that also has those pieces. So here is kind of what is kind of battling out, the bills that are kind of battling out to see if they can, if the Senate and the House can conference and hopefully come to some consensus on some of these. Again, they're closer on some topics than they are on other topics, so at this point we're still waiting to see. The House is almost 6 weeks behind where the Senate is because the Senate jumped right in right after session began. The House, it took longer because they needed to identify the speaker and do the different committees because they had new leadership, had some new visions for that, and so it took a while for them to start hearing bills and really get those going. So there is a little bit of a lull, a time lapse that we're seeing right now as the House is trying to get caught up on some of these bills. When we were in Austin a couple of weeks ago, realistically, I don't know that we will have a definitive answer or a definitive version of House Bill 2 or any of these other topics. It didn't sound like until sometime in May. And however, here are the pieces that are floating out there, and you can see side by side where the House and Senate are aligned on some pieces, and then on some others they may not be as much aligned. But these are areas that we feel like, based on all of the bills that have been filed and conversations that are happening, that will in some way provide us with some additional funding. We just don't know what that is.
Do you have any comments or questions for Christine or the team? I know several board members were able to go with us at our last visit to the Capitol. So any comments or questions on any of the legislative update piece?
The HB2 thing was in committee still last week. Is there a timeline as to when it's going to be voted on in committee?
So what is happening right now is there are a lot of discussions happening informally between the two chambers, trying to figure out where there is some commonality and if they can find some commonality. There's also a lot of discussions happening within the House because it's got to get through the House first before it would even get to the Senate. But there are a lot of conversations happening behind the scenes, and I think that is why Chair Buckley said that most likely it wouldn't get even voted out of committee till probably the beginning of May.
So are there any competing bills? I mean, is 220 going to be, I mean, is that it?
So based on everything that we've seen and based off of all that we've heard about appropriations so far, I believe that 220 is, maybe we could get a little more, but I don't know that we will get, we're not talking the 500 or the 1,000 per student that we were initially hoping for when we were doing our runs and when we were making projections. However, for the basic allotment, the piece that's hard, and that's the question mark, is when you see economically disadvantaged tiers, fine art allotment, those are going to add some things for us. When you see special education intensity of services funding model, we know that that could be significant, and that could provide significant additional revenue for us. But those models aren't out, and
Right.
so they're not releasing the runs of
So
what
we
that
have no
means.
idea what the weighted measures are or what they could
Correct.
be.
Correct. So in looking at it from a step back, and we have had many conversations about how much we needed per student, or we've really looked at it, is the 220 the only thing that that is a known thing, and is it even known? Not necessarily, but when you look at all the other weights and adjustments and even some of the teacher compensation pieces, that 220 in theory could end up more like 500, maybe plus, somewhere in that range, when you consider all of the additional allotments and weighted functions. We just don't have the runs to show that yet.
How did 220 come about? Is this some just arbitrary figure? Is it connected to something?
It is connected ultimately to the overall allocations, state allocations, and they have decided that they feel like they can allocate, I believe, one number was $7 billion, and another one that I saw was maybe another $4 billion overall to public ed from the appropriations. And so that is all that they believe that they can do in the monies that have been allotted. I believe they said every change in increase in basic allotment, I think they even said $100 is something like $1 billion or something along that line that it costs the state. So basically, they've worked backwards. They've appropriated, which they do, because that's happening simultaneously, the appropriations committee. So they've kind of appropriated to all the different programs that they want, and kind of a base. And this is where it would shake out for us with the appropriations. And the bottom line is they say they don't have enough money to do all the increases in intensity of services for special education, the safety allotment that they're very committed to, some of the other weighted allotments. They don't have the money to do both, to do a significant increase to the basic allotment and provide for those previous underfunded mandates, potentially.
Other questions or comments?
I'll just say thank you for tracking this. I mean, this is messy at best, right? And it's great to see this, but we're not going to know until we know. And so thank you for giving us what you got.
Oh, sure, thank you.
Yeah.
And again, I think we are timing-wise, we're at a disadvantage because it took the House so long to get going, unfortunately. But yeah, that's where we are.
Christina, that Senate Bill 260, is that connected, is that gonna help us with that mandate that we had last
Yes.
session, that cost us almost 800,000 or 900,000?
It will, and Todd, you can speak to it more, but last year it was only $15,000 a campus, and that's not gonna cover an armed security at
Right.
a campus. So now with 30,000 per campus, that will for sure help. It won't
won't
cover it
close-
completely,
Won't
but
close
it
the
will
gap,
help.
yes.
No. Mike, do you recall when, what we had to add going into August, when we had to add the armed security guards?
Yeah, it was, the funding that we received was somewhere around 440 or 50,000, and we spent somewhere closer to $1 million for it. So it was about 45% of the funding. So we added, in year 2, we added a few training days. We didn't add any officers, but we added a few training days to the contract. So it was slightly higher this year, but yeah, it'll get a lot closer to coverage of that particular portion, but not 100%.
And there may still be some opportunity for safety grants that were available previously, but what districts said was that it can't all come through grants. We've got to know, we've got to have dedicated monies to be able to make the requirements work. So this is at least a step in the right direction, and more significant than I initially anticipated, so I was glad to see it.
So it's $10 per student plus 15,000 per campus.
So an increase so it was $10 per student, now it's $20 per
Right.
student.
So
Correct.
we'll get 10
We'll
more
get
per
both.
student and
Mhm.
15 per campus.
Yes.
And so Christine, in Houseville
Mhm.
40% of the 220,
Yes.
40% of that will go to pay raises. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
And then enhanced TIA, teacher incentive allotment. Do you have many details on that?
We
Still to be known?
We don't have many details on that. The great news is with House Bill 2 and Chair Buckley's bill, he did and was very purposeful and has been very purposeful in trying to expand access to the teacher incentive allotment, because really before it was very restrictive and not even something that the majority, that some teachers would ever even be able to be eligible for. So his desire is to, and current, the way that House Bill 2 currently is read is to enhance that and make it easier to access for all teachers. But is there more specificity around that right now? No,
Right.
not any more than that.
Okay, which paints the picture and I think makes it really clear, as y'all know, the difficulty of planning a budget for the 25-26 school year. And so we're going to move into, and Melissa's going to talk with you about our 25-26 projections. And you're going to see as she gets into it, the one known, and Christine said it's known and not known. We do not know if this is going to pass, even the 220. But we wanted to be able to show what would the impact be for Belton ISD if we, at the very least, receive that 220. And so, if we can advance to the next slide, the next one. Melissa, there's a lot of information on here. So Melissa's going to walk us through this, and part of this is looking at this current year, 24-25, and then a couple of possibilities as we look into 25-26 based on what we believe we know today.
Okay, so everybody's accustomed to seeing, we always start with the original budget for the current year, and we adopted an $8.1 million deficit. We're going to move to the next column, which is more likely our reality at the current time. Enrollment, everybody knows, came in well under what we had projected when we budgeted. And so you can see what that is doing to revenue. We're taking a bit of a hit to revenues for that loss in enrollment. And then we're also including, and you'll get this number amended in the April board meeting. And this is going to be the sale of Huey Road and Miller Heights. I don't think we've quite closed on Miller Heights just yet, but we're basically taking the closing of Huey Road and duplicating it. And this is going to be net of some closing fees that we had to pay for. So those other resources, that's the sale of those two properties.
So that's the 1.49.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, in the
1.49
second
million.
column from the left.
Yes.
Okay.
So, and then living expenditures as budgeted right now until we know more, with a $4 million vacancy factor. Previously, without the land sale, we were looking closer to $9 million deficit, and so with that land sale, it would put our deficit at $7.5 million, which would still hold our fund balance right there at almost 2.3 months operating at 19%. So we're just under our policy of 20% for CE local. As you move to the right, we're starting to get into the 25-26 year. And we are projecting ADA at 12,457, which would be 92%, like in our budget assumptions that we'll discuss here in a minute. That would be 92% of 13,584 enrollment, which is the demographer's lowest projection on enrollment.
So if y'all recall in the fall when our demographer provided the update, it looked like we might see around a 1% decrease in enrollment, and then he projected it would start to slowly go back up.
Right. So the first column for 25-26 is if we do nothing, basically. So that's what the revenue would, the funding would look like, with revenues at 140.1. And we're basically, for expenditures, we're taking the 24-25 expenditures, moving them over into 25-26. And we have increased insurance and utilities by about $800,000, because those are always going up on us. And just with no pay raise, you can see with doing nothing as far as budget reductions, we would be experiencing an $11.5 million deficit, which would take us down to 1.4 months worth of operating, which is dangerous territory for us. So the second column is basically the same information, just taking the budget, the phase 1 budget reductions into account, right at about $5 million. And you can see there, that would then take us to about almost $6.5 million if you wanted to round up, and putting fund balance at 15%. Okay? So then as you go to the next set of columns, revenues are now going to increase with that $220 basic allotment increase, and gives us about $3.9 million additional revenue. Okay? So as you come down to the expenditures, you would have to, with that basic allotment increase, we would have to give a pay increase of 40% of the gain in revenue. And that would be what revenues would be under the new law versus the 24-25, the current law we're under. So you take that gain, apply 40%. Basically, that would equate to about a $1.6 million pay increase, which is about a 1% raise, right, Todd? Yeah. So we're trying to incorporate some of House Bill 2, the chunks that we could reasonably estimate. Again, building that in. Again, if we did no budget reductions, we'd be faced with a $9.2 million deficit. And then the final column is with phase 1 budget reductions, we're still facing a $4.1 million deficit. So needless to say, the budget reductions are still necessary, even if we got the $220 basic allotment increase. Again, like Christine was talking about, those other funding mechanisms that they're building into House Bill 2 could swing that, maybe, don't know that answer, but so that's kind of what we're up against.
Any questions or discussion on this information?
Melissa, the weighted measures you're talking about, how much is that right now in our budget? Knowing all the special ed and all those kinds of things, how much of that is it, do you know?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head,
Okay.
but I can get that for you.
Okay.
What were you thinking there?
Well, I'm thinking, if they're gonna, the weighted measures that the state's gonna give us, okay, let's say we have, it's $10 million or whatever, and they're gonna give us $5 million, all right, so now we're good. It's gonna take away that $4.1 million deficit.
I think that's the unknown
Right, that's
part,
the unknown, right,
is,
yeah.
it's difficult to calculate without really having the specifics on all those other allotments to know. Does that get us right at a balanced budget, which again, even with just the 220, is not a substantial pay raise. Ideally, you would see where that funding would be large enough to where you could, as a board, decide you could increase that pay raise in compensation discussions. But also, we have a lot of staff. We have bus drivers. We have custodial staff members, staff that are not really specifically focused on in that funding formula as far as that 40%. And so we would need to look at the market studies on those positions to ensure that we're staying competitive in the market on that. So there's just a lot of unknowns still as we're moving forward, trying to develop that 25, 26, because we don't know what those weighted allotments would be.
You know, Emmanuel, what Christine had said in our budget meeting, she kind of, made sense, and we talked about it with Dr. Buckley, is because the 220 is just, when we all saw it, we're like, what in the world? But if they are to start truly giving us more money for special ed, fine arts, economically disadvantaged, I didn't see CTE, but I thought that was one of the things on the table too.
There is some
Additional monies for that.
Right.
Those monies right now are coming out of our basic allotment.
Right.
So even if they just give us the 220, the idea being that, yeah, but all this other money's coming back in because they're now correctly going to fund special ed and all that. So our net could still be high. It's just, we don't know if that, like, when we're doing it in our budget committee meetings, it's like, we don't know if we're here or if we're there. We, we don't know whether we'll be happy or mad at this point because we just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bottom line though is we've got to do reductions.
Right.
Like, any way you look at it,
Yep.
reductions are going to be on the table.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and that's why we asked Melissa to do the last two columns to be able to show, even with, because that's a question we get, if there's the possibility of that increase in basic allotment, does that mean we don't have to do any of those budget reductions? And the answer is we will have to continue to do those budget reductions because, again, even with just that $5 million, and we're going to show you that in the next slide, even with that, we are still sitting with a $4 million plus deficit budget.
Right.
With that being the only known that still isn't known yet.
What is our, and I know we've asked this, but I asked them just away, maybe get a better answer.
That's awesome. Thanks, Jeff.
Lack of sales. What is our best case scenario for starting to see runs come out? I mean, instead of us all just kind of waiting, best case, are we looking at end of May?
So part of the reason that they are hesitant to release any runs right now is because they know that even within the House, they're far between on agreement on some things. So they're worried about giving the runs in current form before they make some adjustments. I do believe that in order to vote, I believe the House will want to see the runs before they vote in the full House. So before it gets out of the House, I believe we will have those runs. So maybe.
When I asked the question last week, I was told they're in process of doing those runs right now.
Will they be piecemealed more than likely? Like maybe 1 week we see a run and hey, here's what we're looking at for special ed, and then maybe the next week we see something on fine arts. I mean, I don't think they're going to put this all out there at one time, correct?
So typically, when they do the run, the formula includes everything. So
Okay.
we get to see Belton ISD, and we get to see how much additional revenue we get in year 1 and how much we would get in year 2. So typically, they will do it all at once. The SPED is tricky for them right now because they're trying to figure out how and when they're going to be able to provide that based on the tiers. And the SPED could potentially, that monies may not come in that form with the tiers until the second year of the biennium, because they're not sure that they will have the calculation measures and metrics in place to do it for the first year.
It'll probably take them time to build that into the formulas.
So you're saying for the first year, maybe more just a block of money, and then the second year would be broken
Maybe
into
a satellite, maybe, I don't know what
Yes.
that would look like,
Yes.
but
Okay.
it will take them time to build,
Right.
because that is a whole change of mechanics in the formulas to change that model, and so
Which
that
is
would.
a little scary going into
Yeah,
the 25,
makes me-
26
yeah,
because
I don't like those changes,
we won't go
but-
into it fully understanding the impact for us until potentially the end of that year when we're doing so.
Of course, and so we're still talking about though, coming out of committee with the runs and for the House to look at it. I mean, there's still that whole big thing called the Senate over there who,
So-
we don't know what they're gonna do when they
So,
see it.
once it is decided who's going to carry the public ed bill, which at this point it looks like it'll be the House.
Right.
Once it gets through the House, then they'll conference. And
Right.
so, between the House and the Senate, for however long however long it takes. Fortunately, a lot of the dialogue, I think, is going on behind the scenes now, so that it's not such a huge battle when it goes to conference. And so some of the things they're trying to get in place and compromise on early, so that when the version comes out of the House, they're closer to, they're not as far apart. So.
Jen makes it really challenging because we're already starting to receive staffing requests for next year, particularly in the area of special education.
Right.
So, okay. So we, on the very far right side in that last run, well, I think there were 2 runs that show you this $5 million budget reduction. And so in the next slide, I think one's a title slide and then the next one. So what we wanted to do is walk through, this is phase 1 that we shared with you in January. And Mike, would you be able to talk through kind of our truing up process? We wanted to just give you an update on where we are in these different areas.
Yeah, so we had some initial estimates on what we thought each of those line items, and those were things that came out of, that were discussed and evaluated by our Budget Advisory Committee. And then since then, we've been working through internally the processes by which we can get to something that looks like it's a more accurate. For instance, we had 2 line items in the budget advisory process of reducing campus and department budgets by 10% and a reduction in overall travel. We've kind of combined those and we've gotten to a little bit truer number on those. There's still going to be a reduction in travel, but it's a bigger reduction overall of about $1.4 million in campus and department budgets. So that's kind of where our truing up has been, and then we've started to look at individual positions. For instance, aligning with the BISD staffing guidelines. Where do our staffing guidelines tell us that potentially we're over the way that our staffing guidelines say we should be staffed? How do we get to a reduction model to eliminate those? So that's a little more, especially on that one, it's a little more detail than we had in the past. The 28-to-1 secondary, and we'll talk a little more about it as we line item, but that is where we are today with the process of evaluating with campuses, discussions with principals, and working towards the creation and working towards our surplus list. So we're at about $2.8 million today. That number actually could get a little better as we continue to work through, or a little higher as we continue to work through that process.
So you see the $125,000, that is for energy conservation. That's a conservative number that if we could decrease our costs by, I think, 5%.
5%, yeah.
That's what that dollar amount is. Program evaluation, there were 2 programs we were evaluating. One was through a special education audit. The other one was looking at one of our more expensive learning management systems. That's Schoology. So we're actually going to bring to the board next month an update on those program evaluations. But just to give you an idea on Schoology, it's about a $48,000, $50,000 product. So just to give you an idea, even if a decision was made at the end of that evaluation, that's not substantially going to change what this number is right here. We'll talk in more detail about the special education audit. That did not, it didn't unveil that we are substantially overstaffed. In fact, additional positions are probably needed in that area, which really matches with the feedback from the listening sessions that led to the adoption of our legislative priorities. And so, so I don't know that we will really see reductions through that. And then Gabby, you want to talk a little bit about summer school enrichment, how you came up with that amount?
Sure. Let me, I'll do reduced substitute costs first for in-house professional learning. What we've asked all of our departments to do is begin budgeting from the beginning, the number of personnel that would need to participate in professional learning, so that we're kind of zero-based budgeting all of those experiences as well. And in addition, maximizing some of our title grant funds to support our professional learning. And at this point, just evaluating our trends from last school year and this school year, we feel like we can reduce about $111,000 just for the cost of substitutes when we're providing professional learning. Related to summer school enrichments, as you all are aware, we have a very large, robust summer offerings in Belton ISD where we've served over 800 students for the last few years. And part of that is because we've expanded it beyond the needs-based summer school learning to offer enrichment during that time, which has been fantastic. And we want to celebrate that and still consider ways to make it happen. But during this phase of the budget planning, we are reducing our summer school offerings to what is needs-based and recommended-based, but also still planning for those students that are needs-based. The enrichment is planned as a part of their day. And so the anticipated reduction there is about $180,000.
What we did not give you an estimated dollar amount for was the outsourcing, potential outsourcing of custodial services and transportation services. So in January, we shared with you that we were exploring that. We have gone out for an RFP on both of those services. One of those closes, I believe, this Friday. Oh, tomorrow.
One tomorrow, and the custodial closes tomorrow, and transportation closes on April 3rd.
April 3rd. Okay, she almost gave me a May. April.
April 3rd.
So once those are received and closed, then a team will move forward in evaluating those. So over the next couple of weeks and potentially in time for the April board meeting, is if we were going to recommend outsourcing, it might be as early as the April board meeting when we would be able to bring that to you.
Can I speak just a little more to the energy conservation plan too? Because that is really is kind of a three-pronged approach. If you remember, we brought, I think back in November or December, we brought to you an item to commission an energy audit. We brought a company in, and we basically took all of our campuses and facilities prior to the year 2000. So everything really from Pirtle, Lake Belton Middle School on back. And that's phase one. So we're having an energy audit done, and they are looking at, are there system efficiencies as we replace units and air conditioning, things like that. Also with lighting and controls, are there some things built in? And so we have an idea that as we go back in and do some things with HVAC systems and lighting systems, kind of what the estimated yearly cost will be. Also, looking at all of our current programming, when do we have lights programmed, air conditioning, heating, things like that, being a lot tighter, how we do those, and then also just creating stronger practices as a culture of when you leave, turn the light off. You know, whenever you leave the campus at night, only the lights that are required to be on should be on. Parking lot lights, reprogramming, making sure that all the equipment's working properly and things too. So we don't know, we really don't believe that 5% is going to be that far-fetched of a number, but it's kind of a three-pronged approach that we're going to take. So.
I might be running around central office turning lights off. Maybe. So we do believe that $5 million might be a little on the conservative side. I think that we still have some work to do in aligning to current staffing guidelines, those kind of things. And so, but the number we wanted to share with you is what we feel was a trued up number, which is right around that $5 million mark. Again, we are not saying today that we are outsourcing. We need to see those proposals. If those proposals come back where it is good for our employees as well as good for the district, there could be additional budget savings in this phase one that we could come back and talk with you about. But we wanted to just bring to you what we have in terms of accurate numbers as of today.
When you talk about outsourcing, can you talk just a little bit about what that actually means? When you mention good for the employees, and I hear outsourcing, can you kind of explain what you mean by that?
Absolutely. So just as an example, prior to even exploring outsourcing, we talked to other school districts who have already been outsourcing to just hear about the pros and cons of that. And again, I don't know what it will be until these proposals come in, but some of the things that were shared with us, currently our custodial team members, for example, pay into TRS and Social Security. We are a school district, one of very few that they are required to pay into Social Security based on decisions that were made way before any of us, like decades behind, prior to us arriving, and that can't be changed. And so when you outsource, one of the advantages for our team members would be they might have a choice. If they're invested in TRS, then they would get to continue to be invested in TRS and pay into Social Security. With the turnover that happens sometimes in custodial services, many are not invested. So they actually, when you outsource, could only pay into Social Security and would no longer be paying into TRS. And so if you think about, that's about 8% of their paycheck-ish that they would be taking home every month that they're not able to do right now. And as y'all know, when we do compensation packages, that's particularly challenging for us in Belton, because as we increase the pay for custodians, for example, and then surrounding school districts wanting to stay competitive with us, increase the pay, automatically, once again, our team members are getting about 8% less because they pay into Social Security here, whereas in other districts, maybe they don't. So that's an example of a savings, or a benefit, I'm sorry, not savings, a benefit to the staff member. Okay. So we're going to keep going. One of the things we said in the January workshop is if we were to enact phase two indicated there would be adjustments to some of the service models. And we said we would come back to you and talk about the progress on those service models, and then we'll talk when we'll make a final decision on phase two. And so, Mike, you want to begin on coaching?
Yes, I will. So one thing that we considered in the budget, or the budget advisory group, was a restructure in athletic period service models, and the initial discussion was what would it look like and what could the potential savings be if we reduced all assistant coaches to one athletic period, returned those coaches back to the classroom. So that was kind of the starting place. But I think as with all three of those, we allowed our leadership to explore what service models could there be that could create savings, and what might those look like. So our athletic leadership, Coach Skidmore, Coach Patrick, our campus coordinators and teams began work with our human resources staff and our principals back in the fall around what would some service models for athletics look like where we could realize some savings. And so it looks a little different for each campus. And there's also a component to it, to how we handle some of our summer instruction for swim lessons and things like that. But at Belton High School, and remember this was for high school only too, we're at 4 boys and 4 girls coaches at each middle school, and with the high number of participation and things that we really weren't looking at the middle school model at this point. It was, could we restructure some things at the high school and have savings that could reduce towards this amount? First thing we looked at was master scheduling and the individual teaching certifications of all of the high school assistant coaches, and looked at a number of what would really be realistic of how many of those coaches have a teaching field where they could go out and gain additional academic periods, and then what's the actual need, and so there was a discussion around that, and looking at the 28-to-1 staffing model with the principals, and kind of where they felt like some of those FTEs that were going to need to disappear, but we could restructure an elimination of FTEs to get to a 28-to-1. So at Belton High School, it's centered a little more around taking a high school that has less enrollment and a little less participation, and restructuring that coaching staff model that going into this year, it was pretty much identical between Belton High and Lake Belton High. Lake Belton High has a higher participation number and higher enrollment right now. So one of the areas was to do some staff reduction at Belton High School, not go down to the one athletic period, just eliminate some coaching positions and get to something that we felt like we could still provide adequate coaching, not have to eliminate some of the B teams and things like that. That was one of the biggest concerns we heard, not only from our budget advisory group, but also as we've discussed this with our budget committee and some of the others as well. And so that was the first step, is looking at a restructure at Belton High School. That's going to change some models of who's coaching what and how many coaches we have with track and cross country and some of those things, plus an FTE reductions. At Lake Belton High School, because of the higher participation numbers, it's a little more of a model of switching what some coaches are coaching. So eliminating some of the coaches that are in PE classes, for instance, pushing them into another academic area, and then using campus coordinators to fill in and cover those PTE sections as well. So, and then the third thing, the third leg of it is right now we do offer some extensive summer and different times of the year swim lessons, and when we staff those with staff, it's paid for out of our M&O budget, like most salary and benefits are. Shifting in athletics and the swim center taking on those expenses to pay their staff for swim lessons, and take that out of the M&O budget for savings of about $20-something thousand.
You're saying, so the revenue generated for the swim center would fund that?
Would fund that.
Which is why it comes out of the M&O, it
Yes.
comes out of their revenues. Okay.
Yes. And so I will say this, because some of these reductions tied directly to some restructuring in our 28-to-1 discussion and things, whether or not phase 2 is enacted, some of these reductions are going to go ahead and take place anyway. And we've already had those conversations with coaches, and we feel comfortable that a staffing model based a little more on enrollment participation is practical at this time.
All right. You want to talk nursing?
Yes. So Mary Lisa, our Director of Health Services, has met with her nurses, and they have been very collaborative, talking through different models for us to get within the recommended staffing based on the TASB audit. So if you remember, the TASB audit said that we should reduce by 7 RNs and 4 LVNs. We have been working towards that now. This is year 2 that we've been working to get within those recommended guidelines. We are working that through attrition. So as we experience vacancies, we're going to work closer to get to that model.
So that's one in January we talked about wouldn't be an immediate savings. We can't surplus an RN. Our commitment was through the surplus process that if someone went on the surplus list, we would look for other positions that they have certifications where they could be placed, and that's not possible in our nursing area, and so it may take time to realize some of those savings on the health services side of that. And then finally, Gabby, you want to talk through process on looking at library services. Phase 2 was to recommend a reduction in 4 library positions.
Yes, so I have worked with really a cross-functional team. We've had 4 design team meetings, and the group has included teachers, library service team members, principal leaders, teaching and learning department, our instructional technology team, so a really diverse group that grounded their work in what should be in a library and what our hopes are for students' experiences in the library. And so established some parameters together around that work. Studied or talked quite a bit about their own previous experiences, both as students and educators in libraries, studied some other models, and then also just brainstormed many different ideas that were on our minds or what could be. The group studied every type of data you could imagine, a much broader list of data than I originally anticipated. They studied circulation in each of our libraries, the enrollment at each campus, even studied the boundaries and proximity between libraries, and then ultimately made some recommendations on some shared models that they then studied or worked through what the intended and unintended consequences of each of those models might be, and then did some prioritization and some narrowing of preference and models. And so we'll, either one of the recommended would result in some sharing across campuses. And so we will continue working with our libraries and our campus teams on what those models could be and communicate very clearly with them if those are the steps that we take moving forward.
Would any of those models, Gabby, result in a library being closed?
No, and that was one of our parameters, not only just it being open, like we have a library on our campus, but one of the tight parameters that the committee felt pretty strongly about was that the library would not be impacted. It would stay open for students at all times.
So when you say shared, you don't mean one's closed one day while another one is open? It
No,
would be
we would have
utilizing
staff.
staff and paraprofessionals to ensure our libraries are open?
Yes, absolutely. Was really proud of the work in this group. It actually, it was very inspiring to hear the hopes and dreams for our services in our libraries in a very challenging situation. And so I was very proud of the design committee. And yes, we want every library to be open as it is right now, and a significant amount of work on how do we increase collaboration across our campuses and communities to improve services.
Any questions for Gabby, Cassandra, or Mike?
One of the great things I think I heard Mike say was, hey, we looked at the model, and regardless of whether we needed to do some of this budget reduction or not, we think we found a better way to do it, right? And so I think that's in there somewhere, right? I mean, I would expect that some of the things that we're talking about, like, might not be a better way to do it, we just got to do it. But there may be some diamonds in there that once we really take a look at it, might actually allow us to deliver services better or differently or more impactfully to our students and campuses. So, so thank you for looking at that and to thinking about it. You know, we got to reimagine it all at some point, right? And keep ourselves moving forward.
I also applaud the collaborative effort with the people that are impacted by these decisions, that it's not just top down, that you have really important and meaningful conversations. I really appreciate that, and I know they do too.
This has been a really difficult season for staff going through this, and it's been really challenging, particularly for staff members that see themselves in phase 2 or phase 3 reductions and phase 1. It's been really challenging. I do appreciate Gabby working collaboratively for the library services. She did get excited after a meeting and say, oh my gosh, there's some excitement actually around one of the models that was being discussed. And not that I didn't believe Gabby, I promise you, Gabby, I did. But I went and met with the librarian who's part of the design team and asked just, okay, tell me how you're feeling, tell me what you're thinking. And so to your point, I think in challenging times, there can be new processes, to some degree, maybe some that are innovative and different. And so I just really appreciate that design team coming to the table, yes, to help solve a problem, but to do it in a way where, and how do we make sure our services are good, if not better, moving forward. And so just appreciate their time that they've given to joining Gabby in this process. And so before we leave this real quickly, because we have to jump to assumptions. So we said in January that we would make a decision that I would announce at the end of March if we were moving to phase 2. We said end of March because mid-March was when no more bills could be filed, and really we're optimistic that there was some momentum and we would know more than what we know today. We don't know a whole lot more today than we did. And so I don't know that 2 more weeks is going to matter. I'm going to be very honest with you. But the commitment was end of March. End of March is technically next week. And so I'm not coming to you today saying we're moving on phase 2. We wanted to give this 2 more weeks and see if we get potentially runs and we start to see that. I've shared with legislators what is happening the longer we go, not knowing what's going to happen with this budget. The reality is nothing may get passed. And so if nothing gets passed, one, we will have already made a decision on phase 2. Phase 3, we said would impact the 26-27 school year. If nothing happens in this legislative session to change the outlook of public education funding, then we will begin our process of looking at what are additional delivery model changes we're going to have to make in order to address a substantial deficit budget. And so right now, we're still on hold, and I would anticipate next week making the final call on if we're already moving forward, quite frankly, on 2 of those 3 areas. So it's truly the library services piece that we would be making a final call on. And so I'll make sure that's well communicated, that I want to give it 2 more weeks. Okay, so based on all of that, we only have about 5 more minutes in this workshop time period. The next slide is a slide of our budget assumptions. Can we, yeah, jump to that. You're going to see these again as an action item. The board's not required by law to adopt budget assumptions. We've made that our practice because this budget and the development of the budget, ultimately the board adopts the budget in August. And so we want to make sure as we go into it, we're on the same page in terms of assumptions. So Melissa, you want to run through these very quickly?
Okay, so for student enrollment, again, we're going with the low projection from the demographer. I believe he brings us new projections in April, right?
Yes.
So all of these assumptions are preliminary, subject to change as more information becomes available. We'll stick to that 92% attendance rate. Again, that's taking refined ADA as the numerator and enrollment as the denominator to get to that 92%. For clarification, we're going to use an 8% property value growth increase, and that's going to, last year it was about 12%, but they're talking about increasing that homestead exemption, so that should put us somewhere in that ballpark. Again, that won't really matter. It's just a matter of reallocating between state or local funding based on the formulas. Staff pay increases and other compensation are to be determined at this point until we know a lot more. Campus allocations right now are about $1,590,000. That is all inclusive of all campus allocations, and so that includes a 10% reduction overall. Some campuses may see an increase in their allocation, some may see a decrease because they're funded on a per student or enrollment basis, the way we allocate their dollars. And so overall, that is a 10% reduction to the budget. Right now, we're going to build in about $500,000 for capital projects, just like we did for this current year. And then, of course, we're just not going to budget new programs or campus improvement going into 25-26. If Todd agrees, we're going to be at $410 per month on our contribution for insurance premiums for the staff. And then you can see there that the tax rate's increasing about 3.34 pennies. That's based on that 8% growth. Again, that's just on preliminary values, and so we'll just have to see what they do in regards to the continued tax compression. More than likely, that rate will change by the time we adopt. So it would be a total tax rate of about 1.16. So we're going to ask for y'all to approve these in an action item in the next meeting.
So we have about 2 more minutes, so we can ask some quick questions, or we can hold our questions and we can ask Melissa questions when we actually have this item coming for action later this evening.
So the phase 2 question will come up in the meeting, and you're going to ask us to approve that phase 2 or not?
No, we're going to give it 2 more weeks, and then I'll make the announcement so that we communicate that well to the employees impacted by phase 2. We had in January said we'd wait till the end of March, so want to go ahead and wait till the end of March, and then we'll make that announcement. So that won't be discussed in this board meeting tonight. I'll just end with a thank you to everybody. We are thankful that our legislators are even considering changes to public ed funding. We appreciate the quantity of times they have visited with us and will continue to visit with us while we keep helping them see the impact of these proposed legislative bills and how that impacts Belton. So we're thankful for their work and thankful to all the people at this table who are helping us work through a really challenging budget season. So thank you, board. Thank you, team. Okay.
Well, that concludes our board workshop. There being no further business, we are adjourned at 6 p.m.